One of the instructional practices found to be most effective in improving reading fluency is repeated reading. We often talk about repeated reading as guided, repeated oral reading. In this presentation, we'll explore what we mean by guided, repeated oral reading and what explicit instruction in guided, repeated oral reading looks like in general terms. After the PowerPoint, you'll see videos of specific techniques. Techniques that fall under the name guided, repeated oral reading have similar characteristics. First of all, they are guided in that the teacher or tutor guides the process, helping the student set goals and providing feedback. These approaches are also repeated in that the learner reads the same text multiple times. With each repeated reading, the learner is expected to become more and more fluent. These approaches involve oral reading in that the learner reads out loud. Reading aloud gives the teacher concrete information about processes that are happening internally. Although the ultimate goal of reading instruction involves supporting students in becoming successful silent readers, we make space for oral reading and instruction because of the insights it gives us as to the internal processes our learners are using. Guided repeated oral reading is important, but before you begin lessons using this approach, learners need to understand what fluency is and why it matters. It's helpful to do two things. First, you want to introduce students to the concept of fluency, and then you want to explain how guided repeated oral reading will help them. The following video shows a tutor explaining to a learner what fluency means and how guided repeated oral reading helps develop it. Even though this video shows a tutoring situation, the same kind of conversation is important in classrooms where multiple students are being taught at the same time. So you can do something similar to this in a classroom setting. As you watch the video, think about what you would expect the tutor to do next in the lesson. We'll come back to this question after the video.
So you're practicing your reading a lot so that we can get more and more like reading is like speaking. So it becomes fluid and automatic, and you're not having to work so hard to break down every word. And one of the ways to do that is to do the same passage multiple times. So it's called guided repeated oral reading. And the guided part is me. I'm going to help. I'm there to help you with words that would be hard to decode.
Okay.
And then the repeating, it's a great way for you to see progress in a really short amount of time. So you might think, why am I having to read this over and over? I've already read it, I get it. But if we can record you, we can show you that like the first reading is maybe a little choppy and you're working hard. And by the time you've read this passage 3-4 times, you'll notice yourself and you'll be able to hear a really big difference in how expressive you can be. And there's different parts of fluency. So one is speed. When you're reading hard material, how it's slow and laborious. So speed, the faster you read, the more fluent you are. Expression. So instead of like just robotic, monotone reading, your voice goes up and down to match the words and to tell the story. It's part of the expression. So you have speed, accuracy, expression, and phrasing. Phrasing is like, remember when we had that book where first we practiced the words, then we practiced 2 or 3 words together, and then the whole thing, we would scoop it, then we would put it in the sentence and it would be all scooped so you could tell like when you could breathe. and do you remember how fast it became easy?
Yeah.
So that's basically what we're doing. So the first thing we could work on, and it's a fun way to practice your fluency, is with reading to your grandchildren. So I know you have a little one.
Yeah.
And how old is she again?
She's 2.
2. Now, I mean, how fun is that to be able to read to your grandchild?
Let's revisit the question that we asked before the video. What might you expect the teacher to do right after explaining what fluency is and why it's important. Consider the following options. It's important that learners know what fluent reading sounds like, so a logical next step would be for this tutor to model for the learner the difference between fluent and disfluent reading. She could do this simply by reading a selected text first fluently and then a second time in a more choppy, robotic manner. She would want to involve the students in discussing that fluent reading is characterized by reading the words accurately, reading at an appropriate rate, reading in phrases, and reading with expression. Then, in future lessons, the tutor or the teacher would model individual aspects of fluency as they become the focus of instruction. They might target accuracy, rate, punctuation, or phrasing, or reading with expression, and the teacher would model those specific items with the specific text being read. At the very beginning of fluency instruction, though, it's important to get across the basic idea of what fluency is as a whole before you start working on individual aspects. Let's think now about how to provide actual instruction in fluency. As a rule, evidence-based reading instruction advocates the use of explicit instruction. And there are usually 4 steps associated with explicit instruction. These are explaining the approach being used and why the instructional goal or target is important, modeling, providing guided practice with feedback, and independent practice or application. Explicit instruction is important because it provides teacher scaffolding while learners gain confidence with the target skill. We would not expect learners to be able to demonstrate a new skill without first telling them why it's important, showing them what it looks like, and working with them to see what it feels like in order to increase their competency. You can see how this process works with a skill related to driving a car. So we do not expect new drivers to hop in a car and automatically know what to do. Instead, new drivers often have a more experienced other, a coach of some sort, to give them explicit instruction about key aspects of driving. For instance, if a driving coach were teaching someone how to use a turn signal, he might first, as we see, explain why it's important to use a turn signal. Under what conditions do drivers need to use it? What happens if they don't? The coach would also model how to use the stick to activate and deactivate the turn signal. The coach might model changing lanes and using the turn signal. The coach would also want to ride with the driver while she practices changing lanes, telling her what she's doing right and wrong as she goes along. And finally, the coach would expect the new driver to use the skill of turn signaling and changing lanes independently as she learns more and more about driving. Feedback would continue to be offered as needed. Now let's see how the process works when teaching fluency. Note, this is the pure version of explicit instruction. Teachers may combine steps in the process on occasion. So the process usually begins by explaining the fluency approach being used and/or the target of instruction. That would be increasing the rate, attending to periods, etc. It's important here to be clear about how the target of instruction, like reading smoothly, etc., helps comprehension. The next step is to model fluent reading, emphasizing the fluency goal. This kind of modeling is usually the first reading of the text or the second if the learner reads first as a baseline. Modeling is sometimes combined with the explanation step, and it can also occur later in the lesson to remind the learner what the target is. Next, the teacher invites the reader to read and reread the text, usually for a total of 3 or 4 times. It's important at this point to provide feedback after each reading. and invite the learner to self-assess his reading as well. Lastly, the teacher has the learner read one last time during the lesson. Afterwards, the teacher and the tutor can compare the student's final reading with her first reading. It's important to realize that fluent reading will not happen in one lesson. Even such aspects as attending to punctuation or reading smoothly will not happen with just one lesson. Learners will need regular lessons with varied and increasingly more difficult material to make gains in fluency. In the next section, you'll learn ways to provide guided, repeated oral reading. You may move now to the next section.